Greetings all, this is Hairy Nick. How you guys going? Welcome back to the Hangar Bay, our weekly show where we take a look at some of your submitted X-Wing lists and critique them a little bit. Over the past few weeks we've been talking about specific ship builds, and this week is going to be no different. We are going to talk this week about the Scum faction again, specifically about, and hang on, I gotta get this right, the Quadrijet Transfer Space Tug, more commonly known as the Quad Jumper, or that thing that blew up in The Force Awakens, then suddenly overnight had this massive backstory. Basically, it's the tow truck of space, hauling around goods and all that kind of stuff for smugglers and gun runners and all that kind of stuff, heavily used by the most nefarious of villains such as Unkar Plutt. And the Quad Jumper did not have much of an impact on the first edition X-Wing meta. It did something unique. It's the only ship in first edition that was able to give out a tractor token during the activation phase. Actually, that is still true in second edition, meaning it does have something unique that no other ship can do, and from that point of view, you can't really say, well, it's definitely terrible, because you can't directly compare it to something else. It always has that unknown factor, which is really good. Moving into second edition, they took away that modification that gave it the ability to do this and just baked it into every pilot card. And on top of that, the pilot cards got a massive reduction in points. Taking a look at the Jakku Gunrunner, for example, when we're talking about first edition with this and the Space Tug Tractor Array ability burnt in, it would have been 34 points in second edition, all the way down to 28 points. And what's more interesting about this is the fact that there is a very tight point band between all of the pilots, and this is something that FFG spoke about what they were going to do moving into second edition. When we have more ace-like platforms like your interceptors, your fang fighters, that kind of stuff, there tends to be a more severe curve when it comes to the quality of pilots. The higher initiative, the more and more the points actually stack up. But with ships that really don't care that much about initiative, like control ships like a Quad Jumper, they just make the points really tight, which makes all of the options on it very, very competitive. Now, I will say, moving into second edition, my opinion hasn't really changed on the best way to build these out. I am still a massive fan of the very, very simple, straight down the line Jakku Gunrunner. I feel like if you have a 28 point gap in your list, it's a great thing to just stick in there, and it's going to help out a lot of other platforms. Now, in previous videos in the Hangar Bay, we talked about being able to fly ships en masse and flying ships with other ships, and I feel like the Quadjumper firmly fits into the latter category. It probably doesn't just want to be flown by itself. It probably wants to support other ships, and support it does a great job of doing. Being able to reposition your opponent's ship, give them tractor tokens, reduce their green dice is very, very relevant. With your brawlers, with your aces, with your bombers, in fact, it has a good amount of application to support a lot of other ships. It just doesn't support other ships directly. Like, there's no pilot abilities that help other ships or pass tokens. It's more an offensive kind of support, if that makes any sense. But look, having said all that, let's start off these lists with a couple of lists that only use the Quad Jumper, just like we have in the past videos. First of all, we have this one here by Dead Man Walk, and this is 5 of the generic Jakku Gunrunners, all with feedback array and one with an informant, which is very, very good. Informant has a lot of upside when you're flying Quad Jumpers en masse. And I think out of everything you can do with these, it's the one thing I'd always say you pretty much got to do. Quad Jumpers, if they're able to look at their opponent's dial, has so much agency to block their opponent's ships. If you're flying against aces, all bets are off. You can do so much to wreck them. Now that you can hand out 2 tractor tokens in the bullseye firing arc, you can move large ships, force bumps, and that's really, really powerful. And feedback array, just a quick chat about this. I am curious about the viability of a bug zapper list moving into second edition, but I am concerned about what feedback array does. It does have a higher ceiling than it did in first edition because it damages every ship in a range 1 bubble around a ship when it uses it, so you can get multiples of your opponent's ships. That's something you couldn't do in first edition, but it does also damage all of your ships in range 1, which makes this kind of strategy actually very problematic, because usually if you're going to fly it en masse. You're going to fly your guys in some kind of tight formation and try and catch your opponent's ships. Just ram into them and make them get zapped over and over again. And if you do that, you're probably going to damage your own ships. Suddenly, that exchange is not very beneficial for you at all. So that's something to think about. Maybe you have to do like a wide box formation where if there's a ship in the middle, it's range 1 to all of your ships, but they're not range 1 of each other. And that's giving me headaches just thinking about it. But it is an idea nonetheless, and I do like how it works with the Jakku Gunrunner. I don't know if any of these effects are particularly powerful, but the fact of the matter is the Informant, the Feedback Array, and the Tractor tokens all work together really, really well, and if flown well, could do a lot of damage. Now, also submitted was this option here by Ravenhull, and this is the similar kind of concept. Instead, we've gone for only 4 quad jumpers, but we've stacked more points of them. We're using named pilots this time, and more upgrades. In fact, we have one of each of the quad jumper pilots. We have a Jakku Gunrunner, Unka Plut, Sarko Plunk, and Constable Zuvio. And look, this is as good a time as any to talk about these pilots. Unka Plut is something that I've always quite liked. He's basically a better version of a Jakku Gunrunner. He just has better tractor control, better upside if you fly him well, which is good. He's kind of the king of the Jakku Gunrunners, which in canon actually makes sense. On the other hand, Sarko Plunk is not a pilot I highly rate at all. His ability just allows him to get an extra green dice sometimes when you limit the way you fly. I've never really understood this ability. I don't really understand what kind of upside you can get out of this. Sure, it's interesting with stuff that could reduce your agility, like there was Exposed in first edition, but that no longer exists. I really don't get this part. I just don't. And the fact of the matter is now his initiative match with Unka Plut. I don't know why you'd ever fly him over Unka Plut. And as brutal as it sounds in this list, I just downgrade him to a Jakku Gunrunner. I find at Initiative 1 they do a lot of work, and making sure you fly before your opponent is very relevant with quad jumpers. Constable Zuvio, on the other hand, I do quite like a lot, and he's only a 5-point increase on the Jakku Gunrunner. Again, that very tight points band is very beneficial for this ship. You got a lot of flexibility when it comes to bombing, and that's really cool. A nice little bit of upside on an already annoying platform for your opponent, and if you can just make it efficient and cheap enough, it means you can get him in under at a certain point level, which sort of encourages your opponent to look at everything else in your list, and he can sort of use the upside of that to bomb your opponent, get a lot of damage across the table, and that's really, really cool. Now, in this list, we have on every single pilot a Freelance Slicer, Proton Bombs, Feedback Array, Static Discharge Vanes, and Constable Zuvio also has Trick Shot. Now, Ravenhull, if you're watching, I think you may have missed something when you're submitting this list. Unfortunately, the Freelance Slicer has no beneficial upside on a quad jumper. It needs to spend locks, and currently there is absolutely no way to get locks on a quad jumper. Don't worry, I've seen a lot of players just put the Freelance Slicer on a few platforms just thinking, oh, it's just a bit of upside in certain situations, when it's not. It's never worth wasting 3 points on something that does nothing. What you can do, and what's really good here, you've actually included a 5-point bid. I don't think you really need a bid when you're talking about quad jumpers. You can take away all of those guys, save 3 points on each, and have a package of 4 different Scum crew, which is actually really cool because Scum have a lot of really good crew and all the bounty hunters and that kind of stuff. May I suggest we take the Informant, Cad Bane, Boba Fett, and Woody Harrelson. Between Boba and Woody, you can mess around with the rocks and change the placement, that kind of stuff. I just spoke about the upside of the Informant before. It's great, and plus you have bombs on this list, so absolutely perfect. Also, Cad Bane's going to have a nice home on pretty much any of these platforms. If you must fly Sarko Plunk, may I suggest putting it on him. If he wants to already fly fast, adding on the boost is going to add another sort of element of surprise to get around your opponent's flying. But ultimately, I do want to have the conversation about this because it's basically this versus the other version of the quad jumpers, which is just generic pilots, but 5 of it instead of 4. Honestly, if it were me looking at these options, I would probably go for the one with more ships. I just think there's more upside there. I think just having more raw guns on your opponent's ship is going to be very, very important, especially when they're only 2 dice each. You need as many of those as possible. These lists basically have to grind out games, and I mean grind out games. You have to keep forcing your opponent into bumps, keep forcing them to fly bad with their tractor tokens. It's going to be a long, hard-fought matchup. And unfortunately, if your opponent just dodges the control for one turn, they can seriously put the hurt on. So I think more platforms is a good thing. However, I will say, Ravenhall, I do like the inclusion of proton bombs. I think that is a very significant bit of upside. You might want to consider seismic charges just to have a bit more agency to move them around and choose different targets after ships move. A bit more flexibility might just be what this list needs. But of course, proton bombs can put on the herd a bit more. So there is a slightly higher ceiling with them. Just be aware that because all of your ships only have 2 red dice, stripping away the shields to get those critical hits through might be a bit more difficult. That's why I err on the side of looking at seismic charges. Okay, let's take a look at a few lists that uses a quad jumper with a couple of other ships. And as I said before, the quad jumper is costed quite nicely, so we can get some pretty serious platforms alongside it. This one by Ivan Stanchev, we have Unka Plut alongside Old Terok and Crassus Trellix on the fire spray. Unka Plut has the Informant, Old Terok has Fearless and Advanced Proton Torpedoes, Crassus Trellix has Saturation Salvo, IG-88D, Cluster Missiles, Seismic Charges, Proton Bombs, and Andrasta. And it is absolutely worth noting, I know, Ivan, if you're watching, you may prefer these pilots, but you can afford to get in what would appear to be the better performing Fen Rao and Boba Fett on this list. You can make that work points-wise. If you don't mind changing up the upgrade, stripping it back a bit, the more competitive version of Boba Fett is no more expensive than Crassus Trellix. However, I do like the idea of this Crassus Trellix build. Alongside Unka Plut, you hopefully have a bit of agency to mess with the way your opponents fly, and Crassus can shoot cluster missiles backwards. And I quite like that. That's a very interesting idea. Alongside Saturation Salvo, you can use those extra charges. If you don't get those multiple targets out, if your opponent's, flying just a couple of aces and you're not likely to get multiple targets down. If you are, you can shoot in the front and the back because of Crassus Trellix's ability. That's a nice bit of upside. I will say, Saturation Salvo is 6 points, and I am concerned about this card because against an opponent flying zero agility ships, big ships in general, that aren't likely to roll a lot of results, it doesn't have a lot of upside, and that does bother me a bit. I just don't feel like this card is really firing on all cylinders. I feel like it could be a lot cheaper for its effect. But I do really like this concept, the idea of having cluster missiles with Crassus, even like concussion missiles or something like that. You don't necessarily have to have those bombs, you don't necessarily have to run Andrasta. You could just run Slave 1 and give him proton torpedoes. Firing them forward and backwards is pretty nice, that's for sure. Something to play around with for sure. I like the idea of Crassus, I think he's very exciting design-wise. But yes, I do have to be honest. I think in terms of consistent meta play, we're definitely looking at Boba Fett. And Old Terok, yes, obviously I'd probably prefer Fen Rao. I do like Old Terok though, he's a lot of fun. Plus there is more significant upside on Old Terok. Being able to strip off your opponent's tokens is always a good thing. And alongside the bombs on Crassus and the repositioning and control on Unka Plut, you can better enable it. Just remember you do need to make that work. Plus you've really leaned into this with advanced proton torpedoes. Be very wary of this because if you don't get those off, it really does feel bad. Basically not getting into range 1 turns off this entire build, which sucks when it happens. Sometimes having a bit of flexibility and being able to adapt to situations is actually better than this kind of heavy leaning synergy. Just be wary of that. However, just all that aside, just showing that we can put these two platforms alongside Unka Plut does seem pretty legitimate. It just goes to show how much of a push the quad jumpers got. Let's move on to the next list we have here. Again, another 3-ship build, this time with the Jakku Gunrunner with a seismic charge, alongside Captain Nim and Boba. We've got bombs on all 3 of these platforms, and that really interests me. Captain Nim has ion cannon turret, seismic charges, proxy mines, Genius, Havoc, and the trajectory simulator. Jakku Gunrunner has seismic charges, and Boba has Fearless, Proton Bombs, Marauder, and Han Solo. Really like this Boba build, just nice and straightforward. We're seeing a lot of Marauder, Han Solo sort of taking off in meta builds, which is great to see. Fearless, I'm not convinced we should be taking here. I am acutely aware of the fact that we have 2 Initiative 5 pilots and no bid. I'd take it off here and go for a 3-point bid. But if you like Fearless, it does offer you a nice bit of upside when you fly Boba super aggressively, which you can do with bombs. And Captain Nim, I am so curious about Captain Nim moving into 2nd edition. I feel like he's been a bit of a sleeper. People kind of disregard this platform because it's lost a lot of its mojo. But guys, it's also so much cheaper. I mean, we couldn't dream to fit these kind of builds in first edition with all these bombs and turrets and that kind of stuff alongside an extra ship. It just wasn't possible at all. And the fact of the matter is the Jakku Gunrunner really does offer a nice bit of control. And if you can force your opponents to fly into your bombs, that is significant upside. It's a huge amount of upside. And I think it's absolutely worth looking at. We've got the classic Genius trajectory simulator kind of package. Alongside Seismic and Proxy, they kind of interact with the board state a bit differently. I personally quite like Seismic and Proton Bombs, but we can't quite fit that in here points-wise. We also have another little bit of control with the Ion Cannon turret. Fantastic, just what we want. And the fact of the matter is, this is probably one of the best applications of Captain Nim because he has the agency to control a lot of bombs on the map. If he needs to drop a seismic and one of your friendly ships need to fly over it, he can stop it from exploding. Those proton bombs can be held in just the right position. Even the seismic charge on him or the Jakku Gunrunner is really, really good, especially if you manage to wedge it between two rocks and you have the option moving from turn to turn over which one you're going to destroy. It gives you a lot of map control, and he can drop bombs after he moves and trajectory simulator and all that kind of stuff. It's just bombing running on a very high efficient level, and we're able to get this at a much reduced rate because we have to remember the timing with bombing is not as degenerative as it was in first edition. You can't bomb with perfect information, you know, hit swarms, hit aces, all that kind of stuff. But the trade-off is we get it cheaper and we get it more flexible, and this just looks really, really interesting. Jack, if you watch this video, please let me know how this goes. I'd love to hear your thoughts. I am keen to play around with Captain Nim myself in the near future. And one last list we're going to have a look at. This actually uses 4 ships. Well, one of them's an escape craft, so it's kind of 3 ships anyway. Han Solo, 4-LOM, and Constable Zuvio. Han Solo on the Falcon has Trick Shot, 000, Agile Gunner, Rigged Cargo Chute, Engine Upgrades, and Lando's Millennium Falcon. The Autopilot Drone is in the Escape Craft. 4-LOM has Debris Gambit, Zuckuss, Inertial Dampeners, and the Mist Hunter title. Constable Zuvio has Cad Bane and Proton Bombs. Before we talk about anything else, love that build. That's just nice and solid. Nothing crazy or off the wall. Do bear in mind that yes, you can't really use Zuvio's ability with Cad Bane's ability. It's kind of a non-bow. You don't want to fly something forward then boost into it. Although in some situations, no, wait, you could. You could drop a bomb forward, boost onto it, then do a 3 forward in clear range 1. Okay, no, that is something you can do, but ultimately it's not really about that. It's about flexibility. I always get the comment when I talk about something that switches off a pilot ability. Always advanced sensors with TIE defenders. I always get so many comments, but you can't get the evade token. You can't get the evade token. It's not about that, guys. It's about flexibility. And even though Cad Bane's ability really doesn't work most of the time with Zuvio's ability, it's absolutely fine. It's about bombing and positioning your ship perfectly, which is very relevant when you have something that can move your opponent's ships. Now, on to the other 2 guys. I really like 4-LOM. I've been playing around with him myself. I really am trying to sort of nail down the kind of approach I use in terms of building out his abilities. You want to focus on things that stress your ship out. I will say, though, I'm not convinced that Debris Gambit and Zuckuss is the way to go. I like Debris Gambit, that's a really cool idea, but alongside Zuckuss, most of the consistent ways you'll get stress into 4-LOM will just switch off Zuckuss, which means he's pretty much wasted space here, unfortunately. Debris Gambit is a great option if you want to get an evade token after a white or blue move, but 4-LOM already has a full stop, which is red. And the fact of the matter is he can use it turn after turn after turn if he keeps passing off his stress tokens every turn. Very nice. I've managed to pull that off in a couple of games. It is a very good feeling. From that point of view, I would not recommend inertial dampeners. He's just got too much agency to do full stops as it is. I don't think there's going to be enough situations where it's relevant. Also, Mist Hunter, yeah, it's a bit tricky to use on 4-LOM because he just basically needs to take actions, and if he does that, he doesn't have any way of stressing himself, unless you've used Zuckuss that turn, but I feel like at this stage, there's still just too many options. You really don't need that. I think Debris Gambit alone on 4-LOM is absolutely worth looking at. And Han Solo, I want to have a chat about the Falcon as well, because this is another ship I've been testing with, and I don't know, guys, I'm really struggling with this ship. I will say I have been using the lower initiative pilots, and maybe that's part of it. But yeah, in my experience, it does feel a bit clunky, and not getting your opponent's ship stressed really punishes you. 000 is part of that. You have to get into range 1, and your opponent has to elect to give you a calculate token, which just doesn't feel like a lot of upside to me. I know I might be being a bit harsh here, but I do feel like when the Falcon doesn't function, it does really hurt your flying. However, I will say trick shot, rig cargo chute, engine upgrades, all solid stuff. Maybe the solution is to just do a bit of a lighter build on these guys. That is something worth thinking about. But nevertheless, putting all that aside, alongside Constable Zuvio, I do quite like this. Zuvio gives you all the control of the Untitled Chapter array alongside that bombing, which is always good fun. And here we have another great example of 2 ships that can be flown alongside him. And he's not taking front and center. He's not the focus of the list. But if he can control the way your opponent's ship flies, maybe you can get better agency to stress them with 4 LOM or use 000's ability with Han Solo. And those factors could be enough to just push enough damage across the table and finish off your opponent's ship. One last thing, autopilot drone. Yes, I've already spoken about this. I'm not really a fan of this. It's going to be really hard to pull off trying to nuke your opponent's ships. With that dial, any competent player is going to fly around it. What I do think gives it value is the fact that you can sort of pop it out late in the game and get another 2 dice attack for 1 or 2 rounds. That seems okay. Like, just more and more attacks is always a good thing in X-Wing. But just be careful if you do fly this. Don't rely on that self-destruct working too often. It is going to be a bit rough, even with the amount of control you have in this list. Anyway, guys, that's all the list we have to talk about this week on the Quad Jumper. Tell me what you think. Have you given the ship a try? What have your results been? If you'd like me to review any of your lists, please, in text form, post it down in the comments below. If you're one of my patrons, post it over on the Discord if you'd like to get involved with the Patreon. All the links for that are down below. Thank you so much to all my patrons. It's really thanks to you guys that we can organize all these videos, really decide on all the archetypes and have these conversations and do a lot of prep for these. I can't thank you enough for how beneficial that is for the channel. In the meantime, guys, don't forget to like and subscribe. Like me on Facebook, follow me on Twitter and Reddit. Consider supporting the Patreon, and I'll catch you guys later on.